Thank you, everybody. We are the judges for Unit 1, and we are going to introduce ourselves, and then I will ask you to introduce yourselves. My name is Darcy Kern. I'm a professor of history at Southern Connecticut State University. I'm also an alumna of the program, and I'm very excited to see you here today.
Good morning. My name is Jamie Gass. I'm director of the Center for School Reform at Pioneer Institute. It's a Boston-based think tank that does research around K-12 education reform.
Morning. My name is Tim Isaacs. I'm executive director for the Center for Teaching the Rule of Law at Roanoke College in Salem, Virginia. And I want to welcome you and wish you good luck with all these bright, smiling faces.
Could you guys introduce yourselves and your teacher, please?
Hi, my name is Abby.
I'm Christopher Goldblatt.
Hi, my name is Jillian Martin.
Hi, I'm Victoria Tong, and our teacher is Mr. Pittman.
Great. So we are going to ask you question 1. And I'm going to read the question and then allow you guys to respond, and then we'll do some follow-up questions with you. So, question 1. The American War is over, but this is far from being the case with the American Revolution, wrote Benjamin Rush. To what extent, if any, did revolutionary principles influence constitution making during the founding period? What problems, if any, does the principle of consent present when creating or amending constitutions? To what extent, if any, are revolutionary principles evident in modern times? You may begin.
I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death. Patrick Henry's words embodied not only the cause, but the principles of the American Revolution.
The lack of colonial representation in Parliament cost the colonists their principle of consent. The colonists demanded actual representation and protection under British law, continually violated. Relation led to a revolution from which a new government was formed, consisting both of principles held in the British government and new revolutionary principles.
The American experiment and Constitution were revolutionary in the creation of a government based in the rule of law with no monarch. Instead of swearing an oath to a president or party, politicians swear an oath to the Constitution and are held responsible for their actions in office.
The Senate originally wanted to call the president His Highness the President of the United States of America and protector of the rights of the same. George Washington and other founders agreed that they did not endure an entire war just to go from one monarch to another.
An important revolutionary principle that characterized the revolution was the idea of consent of the governed.
In the process of discovering independence, the colonists became increasingly frustrated with their lack of consent and representation in the British government. In fact, William and Mary Law Reviews finds, by the time the First Continental Congress assembled in the fall of 1774, the overwhelming majority of American spokesmen had concluded that Parliament exercised no authority by right and very little by consent.
As such, when drafting the Declaration of Independence, the founders derived influence from Rousseau's social contract theory. This successfully created a government based on consent of the governed rather than by divine right, such as with the crown. Benjamin Franklin explained it as such. In free governments, the rulers are the servants and the people are their superiors and sovereigns.
At the Philadelphia Convention, delegates began to consider an entirely new and revolutionary form of government, federalism, which shared power between the states and a central government.
The 10th Amendment is the clearest example of the Federalist balance in the Constitution. It stated that powers not granted to the federal government nor prohibited to the states by the Constitution are reserved respectfully to the states or the people. The debate between maintaining a small government and expanding the federal government is a question that, according to Chief Justice John Marshall, is perpetually arising and will probably continue to arise as long as our system shall exist.
When the Constitution was written, only white landed men gave their consent to a government which would later represent people of all backgrounds and races. This poses a problem because it ties into a larger discussion of what personhood means in the United States.
If women and people of color and even unlanded whites never consented to the system of governance that the wealthy white founders created, but instead were born into the system, does it truly represent the needs of the diverse population of the United States?
The principle of consent also poses problems when modern-day citizens are not able to give their consent to a system that governs every aspect of their life, including potential amendments to the Constitution.
The revolutionary principles that fueled the revolution continue to shape the landscape of American democracy today. Respect for the rule of law faces many modern challenges with people in government abusing their power. Following Watergate came a huge wave of reforms. However, unforeseen changes in the way that money now operates in politics needs to be addressed and regulated.
Political interference in high-profile Department of Justice matters like the Roger Stone case, Michael Flynn, and the Mueller investigation show that the respect for rule of law directly impacts the integrity of our democracy. No one is above the rule of law, and every member of the House and the Senate must hold the president accountable for his actions.
Additionally, a principle that originally meant the equality of sovereign governing has changed to refer to guaranteed individual civil rights. The 14th Amendment was passed to grant citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the United States, including former enslaved people, and guarantees all citizens equal protection of the laws. The Equal Protection Clause, through selective incorporation, allows the system of federalism to evolve and match the changing zeitgeist. To this day, the country strives to embody the words of the founders. May I please finish?
Yes, go ahead. Yeah, finish.
To this day, the country strives to embody the words of the founders. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. Thank you. We are now ready for follow-ups.
You raise a really interesting point about the influence of money in politics. How do we build a better system where money is not as influential in politics and the consent of the governed is more influential?
I think a really important example of this is there needs to be some kind of regulation on lobbying towards politicians. And I think a really good example of that is specifically the NRA, who lobbies a lot of Republican government officials and prevents a lot of common sense gun reform from being passed in the United States, even though the majority of Americans do support gun reform. But the politics and the lobbying from these large corporations are preventing that from happening.
I also think more regulation needs to happen on super PACs and more transparency needs to occur so that the people actually know what organizations are influencing the people that they're voting for.
To build off what my colleague said, when Citizens United was passed, it allowed large corporations to act as individuals and use their freedom of expression as guaranteed in the First Amendment, to allow them to give any amount of money as they want to any political campaign, which essentially allowed them to buy their interest into the government.
Great. I have a follow-up question for you here. During the War for Independence, Washington and his aide, Alexander Hamilton, saw some grave deficiencies in the authority of the Continental Congress. What were some of those weaknesses, and did the Articles of Confederation remedy them?
So during the actual American Revolution, the Continental Congress was an experimental government, even more experimental than the current American experiment, and it was extremely unorganized, and therefore it was hard for them to gain any real power, and it was hard for them to move any actual resources around the colonies.
The main problem that the Articles of Confederation failed to address is that they weren't able to provide a good method for the founders to raise the necessary funds to go to war.
I think the main problem that a lot of the founders ran into was their fear of a strong central government after witnessing the tyrannical government of the crown. So I think they were a lot less likely to give power to the federal government, whereas now we see that it's really necessary and a lot of times. And we've seen the power of the federal government grow more over time. For example, after the Great Depression, the New Deal policies were implemented to stimulate employment nationally rather than have the states take care of that individually.
Adding on to this inability to actually enforce the laws that were put forth by the Articles of Confederation, there was no national court system, which just contributes to the inability to enforce and regulate the laws that were being put forward.
One of the things that you mentioned at least 3 times was the rule of law. Obviously, I can't sit here and not ask a question about the rule of law. Consent is a very important principle of the rule of law. What other principles of the rule of law served as a foundation for the Constitution.
I think one of the major principles of the rule of law is the idea of inalienable rights of life, liberty, and property, echoed in the Constitution as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That was inspired by John Locke. And I think the responsibility of the rule of law is to uphold these principles and make sure that the inalienable rights of citizens are not being harmed by the people in government.
I think another important principle is equality before the law and equal protection of the law, which is why I think the Equal Protection Clause is such an integral part of our democracy today.
I'm sorry, could you say that again? I had a hard time hearing you.
Oh, I just said that I believe a principle that's an important principle of the rule of law is equality before the law and equal protection of the law, which is why I think the Equal Protection Clause is so integral to our democracy.
Another extremely important principle is that no one is above the law, not even the president and the members of the Senate and the Congress. These people can also be tried when they break laws. This includes our impeachment process, which happens for the president, for senators, and for members of Congress.
The rule of law also ensures that the government won't be abusing its power over the citizens because it requires that the laws that it puts forward are consistent with international human rights principles. So in that way, your human rights principles as considered on an international level won't be violated by your country.
Building off of my colleagues, I think an important principle that upholds the rule of law is the idea of popular sovereignty, because it gives individuals a chance through civic virtue to participate in the government process and elect people who they feel will uphold the rule of law and uphold their natural rights as US citizens.
Thank you.
I had another question on, you talked a lot about the president and the position of the president, and I'm wondering if you could speak more about how we hold the president responsible for actions. And again, back to this idea of consent, when only say half the US population is voting for the president, how is the other half giving their consent, and how do we hold presidents responsible for their actions?
So the small population of voting people in our country is a large issue, especially when it comes to people not feeling represented in the government. However, one can make the argument that since everyone who is eligible to vote technically does have the opportunity and the ability to vote, when they do not vote, they do give their consent to the governed, that it doesn't make it that much of a difference to them, and that is them consenting to whomever is elected.
Building off of my colleague Chris, and something he said in the previous question was about the impeachment process and how presidents are held accountable for their actions because they can be impeached if they're not upholding the rule of law. And I would also like to cite the First Amendment and the rights to speech, press, and assembly, because even if people don't feel represented by their government through the voting process, they still have the right to peacefully protest and hold the government accountable for certain actions that they're taking. And we've seen this a lot recently with the Black Lives Matter protests to hold police and other government officials accountable for racial equality.
I'm going to try to get this question in quickly. So following the Declaration of Independence in 1776, several states crafted state constitution. No, would have been a good question.
Sounded like a good one. Well, congratulations, everybody. I'd like to give you a round of applause for all of your fantastic work. The judges will now give you some brief feedback.
I thought that was very good. You guys, you had a maturity in the way that you paused to think about your responses that was very refreshing. I thought you gave a sophisticated answer to my questions. You said, let me see, Chris, you said that not voting, if you have the right to vote, is consent. And I think that's a very sophisticated answer. And Abby, I also liked how you talked about using your First Amendment rights as a means of consenting or not consenting. And I also liked how you talked about lobbying and super PACs and the First Amendment. on my question about money in politics. One thing, and this is not a criticism, it's just something to think about. One thing that you could think about, though, is also the money that the federal government has to use vis-a-vis the states. Because you mentioned federalism and the 10th Amendment in your opening speech, but the federal government that's the one that gives out money to the states. And so, you know, in some ways, the states have become beholden to them because of this money in politics. So again, that's just something to think about. I thought you guys did very well. You raised a lot of important issues. You gave very specific answers, and I really enjoyed listening to you.
Yeah, I would echo much of what my colleagues said, but I first of all want to thank you and your teacher and your parents for all your hard work. It's difficult material. You did a really good job, and I thought that in your introductory remarks, you did an excellent job of kind of I thought one of the main things you focused on was sort of this, you know, tension between federalism and also consent. And I thought that that was profound. And I like the way in which you use quotes and references from John Marshall and the 14th Amendment, et cetera. But I also think both in your introductory remarks and in the Q&A, you did a good job of moving back and forth between some of the historical elements, the principles, and their modern applications. And the first question, I thought you did a really good job of, you know, exploring lobbying and gun control and regulations and Citizens United. But then in the question I asked, I thought, did an excellent job discussing the Articles of Confederation, some of the deficiencies there. And I also, one of you mentioned the fact that there was no court system. I think that is one that's often overlooked. But I echo what my colleague said. I really liked that the line there about the not voting is actually a form of consent. So you should be pleased with your performance this morning.
I was really impressed with the way you built off of one another's ideas. Instead of going in a different direction, which is okay, you oftentimes clearly paid attention to what your partners were saying, and that struck a chord with you. And so you took that idea further and developed it. So, and I have a tendency to keep track of who says what. And there was an absolutely perfect balance, excuse me, between the participation that you all had. And that speaks volumes about how well prepared you were, about how well you worked together as a team. I agree that your responses were thoughtful. One of the things that impressed me the most is that you began at the beginning. And for me, that beginning is the rule of law, because the Constitution is the voice of the rule of law. And you kept coming back to the rule of law to justify other things that you had said. And you were able to use the Constitution effectively and quotes from other documents to reinforce just how important the rule of law is. Your answers were specific, and I could have continued listening to you the rest of the day. You were very, very well prepared.
All right. Well, thank you, judges.